Djazaerly has a book on thinking without care. And today's lecture is going to focus on changing views on the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Professor
Thank you very much. First, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I just want to correct a small piece of information. The one about think without care is not published. That's also now, for Orientalism, given what you heard about my background with French and German, Orientalism has been my interest since 1688. Something that I kept on the side. I spoke about French and German, but then somehow, as the events, especially after 9/11, our identity ended up creeping back despite our effort to put it aside. What I'm going to talk about today, can you hear me clearly in the back? No? Okay, I'll speak up. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So, what I'm going to talk about today are the changes that happened in Middle Eastern studies before and after the man called Edward Said, with whom people associate that change. And the purpose of doing so is not only to give you an idea about what happened to that field, but also to give credit to the people who prepared a road for Edward Said. Most people who know about Middle Eastern studies and about the talk of Orientalism think that the critique of Orientalism started with Edward Said, and that is by no means the case. Now, I'm going to focus on 3 years that really brought about a huge amount of change. Everybody knows what happened between 1978. Not everybody. Most people are interested in the Middle East know about the changes that happened. Edward Said published his monumental book, Orientalism, in that year. And then a year later, he published The Palestinian Question, which is actually an application of his analysis of Orientalist discourse. And I'll be explaining what that is in a minute. It was an application, a concrete application to the question of Palestine, meaning how people were talking about the Palestinian issue, bringing what he has developed in Orientalism to that question. Since that coincided with the Iranian Revolution, which brought down the Shah in '79, he published a third book, which actually focused on how the media, the Western media, was covering the revolution, and with it, since people speak about an Islamic revolution in Iran, meaning covering Islam. So later on, Said said that he considered these 2 books to be a kind of a trilogy, and I look at it as looking at 3 aspects of the Middle East. A general one, and actually Orientalism started with studying Islam, so Islam is the first beginning point of view. The second one is the relationship, which is modern, the relationship between colonialism and the study of the Middle East, meaning Orientalism. And the third one, which is the focus of when we talk today about the contemporary Arab world, the focus of the discourse, which is the Palestinian question. Now, what I want to go back to are 3 years that actually prepared the way for Edward Said, and these years are 1962, 63, and 64. Okay, why these years? Hegel has a very famous saying in his book on the philosophy of right. He has a famous saying which says, "The owl of Minerva takes flight after the dusk." And people can interpret it in various ways, but the way I understand it is human beings, philosophers, intellectuals, begin to interpret historical phenomena actually after they happen. Okay? So what happened? What happened was a huge wave of resistance that ended colonialism. Okay? And to be very exact, there was an event that happened in 1956 when this major Orientalist, French Orientalist, Jacques Derwiche, published his essay, 150 years of Maghrebine means North African sociology, in which he spoke with this famous sentence, l'optique du Euro Arabe, which means the point of view of the Arab Bureau. And the Arab Bureau was the office that the French colonial power created in order to manage North Africa, especially Algeria. So it's interesting that this essay appeared actually that's just after the debacle that France had in Vietnam, and 2 years after the beginning of the first and the only real war of independence that happened in the Middle East, which was in Algeria. Most Arab countries actually got their independence as a result of the disaster that happened to France and England as a result of World War II. In Algeria, it was very different because Algeria was a department, part of France, not some exterior colony. About 1 million French people who lived there, and that made it an atrocious war. Algeria was to France what Vietnam became to the United States in terms of how nasty the war was, but there is a cultural element which does not exist in Vietnam. Again, the fact that 1 million French people lived there. That's interesting. This is once you move that, you end up having some changes, and this is one of them. Okay, so in 1962, and again, that's the year that France got its independence, a professor of Middle Eastern Studies here in the United States at Princeton University published a very important essay called 18th Century Ottoman Realities. And what he did was he demolished an essay that had, or a view or a theory that had dominated to some extent Middle Eastern studies, which had been developed by a person by the name Albert Howell Blair, who had written a famous book about the Ottoman Empire in its zenith during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, that is in the 16th century. And the theory that he developed, which ended up being adopted by two other very important Orientalists, Sir Hamilton Gibb, and Harold Bowen. Gibb was focused on the Arab world, Harold Bowen on the Ottoman one. They adopted that theory. So what was that theory talking about? What the buyer talked about, he said he was trying to explain the rise and the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And what he said was, based on Western resources, because he could not read Turkish, okay, or Ottoman Turkish for that matter, despite the fact that he had lived there for many, many years. He was actually teaching there. Okay, what he said was, the reason for the rise of the Ottoman Empire was the fact that the ruling institution that was administering the Ottoman Empire came mainly from people who were actually of Christian background that the Turks used to take and put into their institutions. Okay? And the reason for the decline of the 18th century was that that rule, meaning taking these Christians who are usually, of course, from Eastern Europe, from the Balkan region, that these ruling institutions changed and ended up having more Muslims inside of it. And that was his interpretation, led to the decline. When we are talking about more Muslims, meaning Turks and Arabs, etc. Well, what Professor Itzkovitz showed was he could do Turkish, and he went to the archives and showed that that was not the case. That in the 16th century, there were actually Muslims whose origins did not come from Balkan regions, and vice versa. In the 18th century, during the Age of Decline, there were actually Christians who were still, meaning Ottomans of Turkish background, who were still in the administration, so that model could not be used. Now, you would think after demolishing the thesis that people would stop using it to interpret the Ottoman Empire, but that was by no means the case. Actually, it continued being important until the 1970s. So that's one important event that happened in that year. That's one model for reading the Middle East which had been demolished. And that model actually is, I would call it a variation on the older racial model, which was developed by Ernst Renan. Ernst Renan is a very famous French person in the second half of the 19th century. Has many books, has a very important book called Vie de Jésus, Life of Jesus. Renan was the son of his epoch. He adopted racial theories and he made claims that actually the reason why Islamic golden age managed to rise and managed to achieve what it achieved, not because of Arabs, but because of the fact that it had many non-Arab, meaning non-Semitic elements in it, mainly Persians. And he went on to show that, well, we know that Avicenna and others, many great scientists of the Golden Age, were actually of Persian background, writing in Arabic. So actually, Bayer was taking that model and adopting it in a different way. This time, focusing on the non-Arabic elements. He's focusing on the people who came from Christian background, but at the same time, that means European background. Okay, so at that same time, there are two works, very important works that appeared and that still have great influence on contemporary Middle East discourse. One was by Gustav von Grünebaum, who came here as a result of World War I when Hitler took over Austria. So he came here, and in 1957 he founded the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UCLA. Okay, and he had, in 1962, he published a very important book called Modern Islam, The Search for Cultural Identity. And in it, he presents several of these antipod theories, meaning what Edward Said was talking about. He was saying that Orientalism was developed in the 19th century during the time when Europe was colonizing much of Asia and Africa, and that parallel to this development, there is a reading of the Orient, which gave the Orient an identity which was opposite to European identity, meaning the development of European identity actually depended on an identity that the Europeans created for Orientals, the people of the East. Now, these opposite identities, we find them again and again, even today. But I just want to give two examples. Here's one of them. The basic difference between the Greek idea and the Islamic educational idea is that the Greek is ever aware of the state. And when he says Greek, that also applies to modern Europeans. Whereas the Muslim is in the service of God. And this is a central idea in Orientalist discourse, that religion dominates the life of Muslim people. I will give another example. This is a longer one, but again, gives us an idea about the discourse of Grünebaum. He says, it is essential to realize that Muslim civilization is a cultural identity that does not share our primary aspiration. And again, here we have these totally opposite identities. Okay? It is even less interested in the structural study of other cultures, either. And this is, by the way, this is a central idea that Bernard Lewis, whom I'm going to talk about later, keeps repeating, that people, non-European people, are not interested here. We are talking about Muslims, are not interested in studying other cultures. What does that lead to? Okay, so less interested in the structural study of other cultures, either as an end in itself or as a means towards clear understanding of its own character and history. What does that mean? That means that these people actually, not only they don't know other cultures, they don't even know their own culture. And the only one who can know their culture is us, meaning us, the Europeans, who actually study other cultures. Okay? So, and then he goes on to say, if this observation were to be valid merely for contemporary Islam, one might be inclined to connect it with the profoundly disturbed state of Islam, meaning now, today, which does not permit it to look beyond itself unless forced to do so. This is very important. Europeans, again, force these people to look beyond themselves. But as it is valid for the past as well, one might perhaps seek to connect it to the basic anti-humanism of this civilization that is determined, that is, the determined refusal to accept man to any extent, whatever, as the arbiter of measure of things. So, the West, it's man who is the arbiter of things, who is the measure of things. That goes, by the way, to Renaissance discourse. Okay? Whereas for the Islamic civilization, man doesn't play a role, and that again goes back to what he said about it's just always about religion, always about God. In addition, these opposites, actually we find them produced again and again, even in contemporary discourse. And I want to give you an example. I'm going to go from these learned professors and give you an example from one of the most famous journalists, contemporary journalists in the United States, Thomas Friedman, who writes for the New York Times. He had an article which appeared, most of you probably wouldn't know, this is 1990, just as the United States and its allies were preparing for a war against Saddam Hussein, against Iraq. And the title is very interesting, The Wall, a Dreamlike Landscape, a Dreamlike Reality. And this is how he starts his article. Okay? The symbol of the West is the cross. Didn't we say that religion doesn't play a major element in Western discourse? It's only the Muslims who are always talking about religion or what happened. Okay, the symbol of the West is the cross, full of sharp right angles that clearly begin and end. But the symbol of the Arab East is a crescent moon, a wide, ambiguous arc where there are curves but no corners. And then he goes on, after this excellent introduction, he goes on to explain why Arabs politically behave the way they do, or they did at that time. It's amazing that actually the New York Times published this rubbish. It's incredible that the best newspaper in the United States, which is considered progressive, open-minded, etc., published this man who's, again, not just some teenage who's dabbling in politics, no, a senior U.S. correspondent of the Middle East. Talking about dreamlike reality or dreamlike landscape, you see this in the image of the West. This is a recent cover of The Economist. Has the Arab Spring failed? And you see one of these, again, the crescent moon and a total barren tree. Again, a dreamlike in a very negative sense. I want to give you another contemporary example. This is a movie made in 2007 called Rendition. Anybody saw it? So, and this movie was very critical of the rendition program. What is a rendition program? It's the program that was created after 9/11, whereby the U.S. government arrests certain people and then sends them overseas to be tortured in all kinds of centers around the world, whether it's Jordan, Syria, Morocco, Egypt, Poland, etc. Okay, so this is a movie that is very critical. This is a liberal movie. This is a progressive, open-minded one. But here's a comparison that we see between them and us, between the East and the West. This is a discussion that's happening toward the end of the movie between the CIA agent and the minister. Is it a Moroccan minister? Is it an Egyptian minister? We really don't know because the movie doesn't, it's actually filmed in Morocco, but some people are speaking this and that dialect. It doesn't specify a certain country. But no offense to any Moroccan, let's call him Moroccan minister. Okay? So the Moroccan minister explaining why he goes on torturing this guy, despite the fact that all evidence speaks to the contrary. To be very exact, the CIA tells him this guy has a salary. He's an American. He has a salary of $200,000. Why would he do some terror operation for $40,000? So the Moroccan answers, well, we have a saying, meaning we Arabs, we have a saying, beat your woman every morning. If you don't know why, she does. Okay? And the CIA guy looks at it and looks at him and he says, I don't know what that means. Do you know who Shakespeare is? He said, of course I do. So he said, well, Shakespeare says, and this is from Othello, but I fear you speak upon the rack, where men enforced do speak anything. Okay, so here's the comparison. The Arab who speaks such misogynist, disgusting proverb against women, totally irrational, has no rationality or sense of it. It's a savage one. And here's, of course, Shakespeare, who not today, centuries ago, realized that torture doesn't make sense, that torture makes people say anything. So what I'm saying is, despite of Saeed in public media, it's actually these opposites of identity of the East versus identity of the West. And now we can be more very specific, identity of Arabs versus Americans or Europeans that goes on and on. So that if we give examples, we can see that in Orientalist discourse, the East, to be very specific, the Europe here is static, it believes in slavery. And you're going to tell me where I'm getting these from? Again, we can go and come up with examples, one example after the other from books and essays. Okay, believes in slavery, totalitarian, tribal, spiritual, irrational, doesn't study other cultures, and then Arabs, to be specific, understand only honor. On the other hand, the West is dynamic, it's not static, believes in freedom, it's democratic, contrary to tribalism, believes in individualism, is not irrational, it's scientific, studies other cultures, and then understands responsibility. Remember what Grunewald said about the state. Okay, 2 years later, Bernard Lewis wrote another very important book that most people actually today don't read. But it is a very important reading. It's a very important thin book where he represents his vision of the Middle East. And it is very similar to Grunewald. Now, the reason why people today, Bernard Lewis today, is much more famous than Grunewald, the fact that Bernard Lewis presents all his readings in very simple language. His books are usually thin. There are no lengthy footnotes. In the case of Grunewald, it's exactly the opposite. Grunewald is of a German background. He's Austrian, but German academic background. They call it Deutsche Gelehrsamkeit, where professors should show that when they present their argument, they present it in immense erudition. So when you read Grunewald, you have footnotes that run on for pages. Okay? And then you have all these introductions that carry German philosophy with them. None of that in Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis is ideal for presenting simple language, discourse, discussion to people, very, very accessible. Well, this book was actually the result of a series of culture lectures that Bernard Lewis presented in the United States, where it was after the Suez Crisis. I don't know if you happen to know what that is. In 1956, there was a war between Egypt on the one side and Israel, Great Britain, and France on the other side. Okay. Now, if you listen to Nasrites and to their friends in the Arab world, they tell you that Nasser won the war. By no means. Okay, the one who won the war for Nasser was actually the United States, for reasons that this war happened totally behind their back, and caused the United States immense problems in Eastern Europe. And because the United States got so angry, they forced these three allies to actually withdraw. And that, well, Nasser played the picture. The relationship between the United States and Britain, because of that, became very bad. Actually, it's the lowest point in the history of their relationships after World War II. So England selected Bernard Lewis to send him on a diplomatic mission. So he spent 7 weeks traveling around the United States, talking at universities, appearing on the radio and TV at that time, and the result of that, a series of lectures, he put them together in a book. Now, the book ends with actually 2 chapters. If you go and read these 2 chapters, you will see, and then you read his essays later on, you will see that he actually, since then, he has developed nothing new. Because that chapter has a book called The Revolt of Islam. It's the penultimate chapter. And if you look in history of his writings, in magazines and newspapers, you will see that that title comes up again and again. The Return of Islam, The Revolt of Islam in '83. Again, The Revolt of Islam in 2001. And when you compare the two, Grunewald and Lewis, you will see that Lewis is not original at all. Everything that Lewis says about the Middle East, you can actually already find it in Grunewald. And if you do your historical work, and people, I presume people are doing it and are going to do, you can actually trace Grunewald to older texts, because again, you can look at the book, it has huge footnotes, and that's what we are talking about. That's what we're talking about, what we mean by Orientalist discourse. In 1990, Bernard Lewis published this essay in the Atlantic, and that's when the word clash of civilization, the concept of clash of civilization became popular. Actually, he had first presented that concept in the last chapter of this book. Okay? But at that time, nobody was interested in it. Why? Because to the United States, the enemy at that time was not Islam, it was the Soviet Union. It was communism and the Soviet Union. And they knew that Islam is a tool that they can use in confronting that communist threat for them. Soviet threat, which we saw in the war in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion. But once the Soviet Union went down, then the same old chapter got, so to speak, unearthed from that book and was published as an essay in a popular magazine. And now the response is completely different. Why? Because the Soviet Union is gone, and now we need a new enemy. And the context, of course, was the war in Iraq, so it became very popular. Not only it became very popular, it actually became, it moved, with that year, we moved from Orientalist discourse, the Orientalist discourse of the clash of civilization, them versus us, became actually world political discourse, thanks to Samuel Huntington and his world bestseller, The Clash of Civilization. And of course, Huntington does admit that he got the concept from Bernard Lewis. Well, actually, it was not Bernard Lewis who developed the concept. It was thanks to Wikipedia. Anybody who tells you Wikipedia is not useful, tell them they are not telling the truth. It's actually very useful. And I use it like many other people, not exclusively, but it is useful that you do the research. Okay, so actually the concept is older than Bernard Lewis. What Bernard Lewis did, he took that concept from its missionary context and put it as acceptable academic discourse. Bernard Lewis, by the way, always moves to a new level of originality. So in his autobiography, which he published 2 years ago, he talks about that war when he used the word clash of civilization, and this is how he describes that war: Cubatus interruptus. This is very original. I will leave it to aside. He's still alive, by the way, despite he's now 98 years old. There's still a chance to take him to some psychologist and have them analyze the impact of not having the United States fully penetrate Kuwait, the impact on his own sexuality and psychology. Okay, now, again, we have some mishaps here as I move the presentation from my computer to this screen. So the page disappeared. This is an essay by an Algerian called Mohammed Arkouni, who published actually, and this is what's new about these years, is finally you have some Arabs responding to Orientalist discourse, whereas before it just passed, most of the time just passed without response. So in return to the book I talked about, in response to the book I talked about, Grunewald's book, there was the essay of Islam as modern Islam as seen or as viewed by Professor Grunewald. And Arkouni criticizes Grunewald for 2 points, and these 2 points are going to become essential for Orientalist critique, meaning critique of Orientalist discourse. And these are the essentialist arguments about Islam. What does that mean? Meaning, when people are always telling you that this is what Islam is, and remember, this Islam is always static, unmoving, unchanging. Okay? So that's the first critique that he has. The second, and this is a very important one, he says that Grunewald and other Orientalists, but here he's talking about Grunewald, disregard socioeconomic factors. And this is very important for our understanding of the critique of Orientalist discourse. That it's usually always talking about culture and texts, and usually doesn't pay enough attention to economic factors, meaning the economic condition and how they impact society and how they impact culture. Again, another mishap. Abdul Latif al-Tibawi published an essay, so he moved now from talking about one Orientalist, we are talking to a group of Orientalists, English-speaking Orientalists. Okay, and another one came from Anwar Abdel Malik, and this is actually the most important essay for Edward Said. Anwar Abdel Malik was an Egyptian sociologist, and he wrote this incredibly important essay called Orientalism in Crisis, published again in 1963. And in it he says, for the time being, the crisis strikes at the heart of Orientalism. Since 1945, in this movement, it has been only the terrain that, it has not only been the terrain that escaped it, meaning these colonies, but the men until yesterday, meaning the people of the colonies, who were looked at as objects they became now sovereign subjects, meaning they got their independence. And